hope people had a chance to read the Ray Raphael chapter and watch Birkin's video at the Society of Cincinnati, and maybe get into the Brewer piece a little bit. But I guess I shouldn't presume people have read those. I think the key to thinking about this as we get into it as teachers and as public historians, people thinking about how to include those underrepresented voices in American history is to think about agency and what questions historians ask. It seemed to me that most of the principal question historians have asked around women in the American Revolution is, to what extent was there change? Was it, and if so, was it a change that was progress and made things more, if you will, more rights, more interaction and involvement in roles in society that had to do with the civic life, for example, or was it a diminution? Did they lose some power in that? And that debate about the role of women in the revolution, to what extent did they play a role, and to what extent were things a change for them, I think is something that gets students excited. They are interested in being able to debate that and see where historians have parsed out evidence on one way or the other. And I'd say that a lot of students, at least at the level that I deal with, are usually come into it, the story of the American Revolution, women in the American Revolution, with kind of the exceptional stories. They might have heard Deborah Sampson and the fact that she's actually recently been in the news because a diary was found in Maine and sold at auction. That's going to be part of the Museum of the American Revolution from one of her neighbors, which tells the story of, a woman who wanted to participate in the American Revolution, joins the revolution by cross-dressing as a man, and does indeed fight in the revolution. And we know a little bit more specifically about that. She went, in fact, on the speaking circuit after the revolution. So her story is an exceptional story, again, of a woman who participates in the revolution as if a man. Or there's Sybil Ludington, who spreads the word about that Danbury is burning in Connecticut. Those are kind of exceptional stories. They also sometimes, I'm going to apologize here, I'm about to have my son's new kitten walk in front of me. So here he comes. He's trying. Okay. Well, that's I'll give you a look at him. Here he is. Hi. So I think these kinds of exceptional stories of ordinary women participating as men or doing things as men are what a lot of students come in with, or they come in with stories that also seem in some sense exceptional, of maybe a Mercy Otis Warren, who writes the first history of the American Revolution, or of Abigail Adams. I think the phrase "remember the ladies" is one that not all students know, but some students do, and they certainly don't know it in depth. And I think Bob's going to talk about that, and certainly Kate will talk a little about that. So I think the question again of change is really important, and how to get at that, looking at secondary sources and then getting students to sources is where I start. So let me just pause there and see if we'll have responses or reactions to that framing. Bob, you want to take exception to that framing, or suggest another frame, or any?
No, that's fine. I think we do have the tendency to look at the exceptional or those who are available. I think one reason we know a lot about the Adams is they wrote everything down and kept it.
Right.
But yeah, and the Deborah Sampson story, in one sense it is atypical, in the other sense it's typical. If you want to know what life was like for a typical soldier, that's during time in camp, her story tells that. But yeah, and so I think getting at something else is different, and looking at women and children as part of history. I think your idea of agency is essential, because it's not just the sidewalk. This is a history that does require us to rethink the frame we have of this. Laurel Ulrich does this really well in her book on Martha Ballard. You have this whole book about this period from the Revolution to 1812 that doesn't mention things like the bank or that is something else is what requires us to think about. So it is kind of ironic to hear a bunch of us guys talking about women in their history at the time of the revolution.
I'm glad that we're going to have other voices, either we've had assigned or we're going to have other voices come in, real live female voices talking about this. And in many ways, I think that points to the scholarship. The history of looking at women in the American Revolution changed dramatically about 40 years ago when new social historians began to think about this. Gerda Lerner wrote a book, the Women in American History. I think that came out about 1971.
Mm-hmm.
And that really framed a lot of the questions for people who then went on and asked, what were the roles of women? And there was, I think in 1976, 1980, a couple of key books, Mary Beth Norton's book, Liberty's Daughters, and Linda Kerber's book, and her collection of essays, really, as well, about women in the American Revolution, reframed things. And then people started thinking about the civic virtue of women and what role they played in shaping civic virtue. And the concept is almost pat now in American history classes of Republican motherhood. Right. The idea that women had a role in shaping I think that grew out of an understanding, as Ray Raphael points out in chapter 3, that women became involved because they, at the beginning, in part, because they had economic and political agency, particularly economic agency, because there had been a consumer culture, a rising consumerism in the 18th century, and women were at the center of that because they ran the household economy. Yeah. And when the Stamp Act and tea rebellions began in the 1760s and 1770s, women were able to protest that, either with homespun, as Raphael points out, or protesting tea in various ways. And I love the quote on page, I think it's 111 in Raphael. He has that wonderful poem, "Let the daughters of liberty nobly arise, and though a voice give here, the use of the taxables let us forbear." He goes on with there. It's a great piece that women are involved in protesting the tea, and of course that spread to Edenton, North Carolina, most famously perhaps because of the political cartoons that came out of England that make fun of the women in Edenton. But that civic participation through the household economy is a great way to get a number of primary sources about this. So I think there's a wonderful document-based question that's put together by Binghamton. The Binghamton Women's History Project put together a DVQ, which I'm happy to share online if I'm allowed to, which begins, in fact, with that same poem. That's a Hannah Griffiths poem that Ray Raphael points out. He says women wrote poems. In fact, the woman who wrote the poem was Hannah Griffiths, The Female Patriots, 1768. And that's the first document in this document-based question. And there's another one about the ladies' boycott agreement of 1770. And then there's a wonderful excerpt from, there are a number of other excerpts. There's one from the Essex Gazette in Salem, Massachusetts, which I like to plug any moment I get, which I just want to also point out. It says, "The gentleman of Newport writes, being the sign of Pitt's head in this town tonight, on Tuesday last, was extremely pleased by having admittance into the company of 11 of the daughters of liberty, ladies of character, and lovers of," notice this, "British freedom and industry, each being laudably employed on a spinning wheel. They determined to convert each visit into a spinning match, and to have no entertainments but what is to produce of their own country, and to appear as possible clothed with our own manufacturers, that more especially which is the effects of their own labor." Right. I think this kind of points to an interesting point about these women taking agency, being involved, but it also has an interesting bridge. It's this idea of make local, buy local, right. Which, is kind of a rhetoric that you hear today. You know, go to the farmer's market and buy things there on the really local basis, or in a broader basis. Geez, we should buy things made in America. If you can find anything that's completely made in America today, I don't think you can. You know, but it allows for an opportunity to open up that discussion. So let me again pause there and see if others want to chime in.
It really gets to the different. I think a lot of our students are very much rooted in today and how the world works today. This really requires us to think about how the world worked then. And women were essential, as you said, to this household economy. And they are real agents. They're buying things, they're making things, they're selling things. The women who are spinning, I mean, spinning is something women did anyway, and knitting, weaving is something they did anyway. And they're competing with the rise of manufacturers in England. So we see this as really a critical moment in a lot of ways for this. And this domestic economy is going to be a big thing, you know, well into the 19th century, and as you mentioned, well into today. You know, a couple of years ago at Houghton Library, they found a document from the, you know, the protests over the taxes in the 1760s and the non-importation agreement that about 600 people in Boston signed this, saying they're not going to buy British goods, and about a third of them are women. And so they are involved in this world outside the household. And that then will let us think about, well, does this change in the course of the revolution? And some of the books you've mentioned, Linda Carver's, Mary Beth Norton, suggest that it does. There is a move back into the household. You know, also, a lot of our students grow up in kind of the post-Betty Friedan era, where we think women didn't do anything until Betty Friedan came along. Well, actually, they're doing a lot of things. And this is a period when they're doing a lot more than they were in the 1950s, or, you know, so it's really an exciting thing to be looking at it from this point of view and seeing what are people doing in the household, which is different from what people do in the household today.
Well, and then that begs the question, what about the public sphere? Do women get involved in the public sphere, and how do they get involved in the public sphere? And clearly, with an Abigail Adams letter to John Adams, you see how engaged she is in what's going on in not only in Boston with the evacuation or the occupation and the evacuation, but also she's thinking about what's happening in places like Virginia.
Sure.
And I'm thinking about the initial letter, remember the ladies' letter, which has this wider context. What's happening with Dunmore's proclamation in Virginia?
Yeah.
She's engaged, thinking political world.
Oh yeah.
And yet I think most of our students don't understand the concept of coverture, which I think is worth thinking about, and having them understand the sort of legal context that they're, quote, covered by some male member of their household legally, and they have no real legal voice but across the colonies, it's uneven. In some states, they have some rights more than others. The issue of divorce, the issue of inheritance becomes really wrapped up, and as you point out well, Bob, in the wonderful, I would highly commend to anybody who's interested in this topic, and I think I put the link in there, and to watch the wonderful documentary film that was done of Laura Thatcher Ulrich's book. By the way, another Kidger Award winner, together with Bob Allison, both Kidger Award winners from the New England History Teachers Association. Laura Thatcher Ulrich 2 years ago and Bob Allison this year. But the video of that midwife's tale does get into both the private, the household economy, but also this public sphere and how women did have a role in court trials, did have inheritance, and then did not as well. The main character, Martha Ballard, is sort of pushed to the side as her husband becomes infirm, and her son takes over the farm, not she. And you see that. And I'll just sort of trying to put things out there for people to think about. And when state constitutions are written, of course, they're questioning who's going to be and defining who's going to have political power. And New Jersey makes a mistake. The mistake is they say that all people who have a certain amount of wealth have the right to vote. Well, it turns out there's some women in that group. And so a bunch of women have the right to vote until the men sort of say, wait a minute, about, I think something like 1804, they rewrite the Constitution and say only men of a certain amount of wealth have that right to vote. Bob, do you want to chime in on any
No,
of this?
that's good. It's very good. Yeah.
So I think, thinking about women in the private sphere, and then how they are sort of breaking into the public sphere. And one way they break into the public sphere, by the way, that sort of pulls this together, I think, is the story of Esther Reed in Philadelphia, who runs the Ladies Association in Philadelphia, supporting the American Revolution, and raises her obituary in 1780 says that she raised over $60,000. I don't know if that number is verified, but it says that she helped raise over $60,000 for linens, shirts, clothes, shoes for Washington's army. And that's a significant, that's moving from just doing homespun and making your own goods to really a massive political engagement and economic engagement that I think can say was a turning point in the revolution, or at least a hinge somewhere there, a hinge that did more than just sort of help out. They weren't just campers, which of course every war has camp followers.
Right.
But this is moving to something different. It's women's political engagement.
Yeah, the women in Philadelphia in 1779 or 1780 raised money for Washington's army. And one idea is to give every soldier $1, because that's basically what they've raised. $1 would be a lot more now. They're afraid they'll spend that on drink, and Washington is as well. So instead they give every soldier a shirt, which they need. Might have preferred the drink, but the shirt is definitely something they need. But yeah, they are engaged in this cause in a lot of ways, by not buying, not selling, or by producing things. But then, as you mentioned, they don't have this political voice. And there's a good theory behind this. And since we're all men right now, I can say, yeah, there's a good reason women didn't vote. But I think our next session, maybe Gorman will take that on, why that's a good thing.
Why women didn't have the right to vote.
I just keep thinking about
I think.
Oh, hello.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. When you're talking about the women in the home and what they're doing for the boycotts and what they're doing to have these homespun parties, is the influence that's going to have on the children, because they're seeing that. They're seeing the women get involved. The men are off fight. They're seeing more of that, and then how that's going to affect the next group of the generation coming up as they see these women as active and involved.
And that, I think that speaks right to the concept that sort of emerged in the 70s and early 80s of Republican motherhood. The women's, not only their participation, but their participation as a role model for civic engagement, is what I think Mary Beth Kerber argued, as again, women having agency, and indeed it being a change for women that was more profound. Because of these individual acts, collectively, women did advance. I think that's what some historians have argued during the revolution. Now, not all historians argue that. And those of you who might have taught to AP US History might know that in the most recent AP US History exam, there was an example of one historian who said that women advanced, and one other historian said women did not advance. I mean, come on, the second historian argued. Women were certainly not only literate, but they were writing. I mean, we have, everyone from Phyllis Wheatley and her poetry to Mercy Otis Warren and her history. So there are lots of lenses in that provide female voices to the story of the American Revolution. I think that's what, if you go back to the 50s, people said that all you really could look at were manners. And the history of women was the history of manners, and really not, or maybe I'm back to the 20s and 30s. But by the time new social history begins uncovering the stories of women, we're looking at those voices those writings in a completely different way. And I love the list where page 128 and 129, where he talks about in his section on shaming, sending the sons and husbands to battle, in which women obviously entered into a new political community created by the American Revolution. On page 128, he talks about women's involvement in different ways. Hannah Dickinson, Hannah Robinson, Betsy Cross, and the Carpenter's Wife. This is a great piece to teach. I just think that section is a wonderful piece to teach. I think get into it and compare. It's very different, or really, if you will, a rather precise way of looking at the American Revolutionary experience of women and men fighting. And another way to do that, for example, would be to look at people who are really interested in the American Revolution in this period often are reenactors. And here in Marblehead, last weekend, we had the Marblehead Glovers Regiment had a weekend of reenactment and an encampment, and I would say probably close to 50% of the people there were women.
Wow.
And they were in the camp, and they were making food, and they were fighting. Some of them cross-dressed as men. They were doing everything that women were doing, sort of, if in that really focused way during the actual revolution, which is what I think a lot of, at least my students think. And when you talk, I get excited about that. They kind of have a harder time wrapping their head around that. They're often interested in, not but often interested in, what are women really doing, and does it really have an impact? And when you look at a community like that reenactment last weekend in Marblehead, you saw the women were doing things that there was no way the men could have fought the war, or the men and the women who were fighting the war could have done it without them there. It did change the tide.
Or even when men weren't out to war, I mean, the women were the ones who took over the men's responsibilities at home, on the farm, in the field. And so you wonder, had they not been there, could the outcome of the war be different? So, I think that's another thing that Raphael pointed out. The majority of women were illiterate, but they really answered to the call of duty. Once the men went off to battle, they were the ones who kept the community and kept society going.
Or sometimes they were, as he points out, forced to fight, if you will. I'm not so sure, but he talks about Helena Courtright Brasher, who was forced to flee the attack, but in the same time turns around and fights, and talks about the who are really the ones who get forced into this frontline situation more than others. I think this chapter is really great for that. I mean, there's an awful lot that can be pulled out of that chapter. Bob, I want to make sure you have plenty of time because I know you have to go.
No, well, another area.
Talk a little bit
about another area where I think, and this also gets to the difference between the world our students live in and the world of this time. Women were very much involved then, is now in churches. And you see a similar trend today, but that was such a big part of everyone's life, that is their religious life. And that's an area where you do see a lot more, even though women were not clergy, there are a few exceptions, like among the Shakers, Sister Ann Lee and so on. But among church members, church memberships, I mean, that is the big community there. And if we think about then women as transmitters of culture, that's an essential place where this happens. So it's another place to think about that may be off our radar, since we do look at what's happening on the battlefield or what's happening in the political arena. But if people, I suppose, in the 18th century were thinking about the public sphere, the main place where that would be happening would be in the meeting house or in the congregation. And that was the community to which most people belonged. And women were really essential in forming that.
I'm thinking about the massive change that happened with religious life during the Revolution. And begins earlier with the First Great Awakening. But by the time you get, I'm thinking about African American congregations that we'll be talking about later. Next week, we'll be talking about African Americans. And one of the people that pulls me in is David George and his Silver Branch congregation, who end up being loyalists. And the women are really central to that congregation and play a major role in supporting David George and supporting the embracing of the British in the South because it was an avenue to liberty for
Right.
African American women in the congregation. So that's the connection I was making.
Yeah. Well, when Washington arrived in Cambridge, he does try to get African Americans out unsuccessfully. He also tries to restrict women. And always, this is a persistent problem. Whenever the army is on the move, Washington says, okay, the wagons are reserved for the men, and then he realizes they need these women. When he tries to exclude them from the camp, he realizes, well, who else is going to be doing the laundry and tending to the wounded and other things that the camp followers are doing? And so the women are simply ride in the wagons. I mean, they don't mount a protest, but it's going to slow everyone down if they are walking. And so this is a persistent, I'm not going to say a problem, but an issue throughout the revolution is you do have this army that relies on these women who are part of it, or the fighting. And then you see episodes, I know Deborah Sampson is our official state heroine. I believe New Jersey's maybe Molly Pitcher. If not, she should be. And it's an anonymous person. It's actually from Massachusetts. The woman on whom we think Molly Pitcher was based is from Massachusetts. But again, Molly, typical name for a woman whose name you don't know, and Pitcher, she's the one with the water pitcher. And her husband's shot, so she starts tending the gun. There's a wonderful 19th century engraving of this scene, this inspiring scene of woman on the battlefield, doing what in the 19th century women certainly weren't doing, being on the battlefield, tending to the gun, and until the late 20th century, women weren't doing. Again, getting into the atypical as opposed to the typical, and how that forces us to reframe the way we think.
Just going back to the Marblehead encampment last weekend, or the 4th of July, that same group was firing a cannon at Fort Sewell, and there were 2 women, I think, involved in helping fire that cannon. I don't think they're trying to be completely historically accurate, but they're trying to give a sense that women were involved.
Oh, yeah. Just a more contemporary anecdote. I have a student, she and her mother moved to Lexington. She loved history, wanted to join the Lexington Minutemen. Of course, the Lexington Minutemen are all men, so she could not join the Lexington Minutemen. She did, however, join the Redcoat Regiment. So she was able to fire, she was very excited. She said, I get to kill Harrington.
That's great. That's great. So I think I'm always going back to how do we teach this? I think enlivening this, looking at these primary sources and collections of primary sources, and then looking at different points of view from women on the battlefield or women and homespun. I think that one is perhaps more document sets on that exist than women on the battlefield. And then getting to sort of the broader Republican motherhood or legal, social, broader issues. Looking at watching something like A Midwife's Tale, the story of Martha Ballard, and then looking at that, I know it was done a while ago, but the wonderful web shows with it, Do History, I did put on our site for people to take a look at. That it not only gets us into women in the broader American Revolutionary context, but we actually see women scribbling. We see much more than they're scribbling. Her diary is not a scribble.
Yeah.
It is serious. It is. In fact, it's if anything, it's overly. Some would say overly serious. It's hard to find emotion in it. And Laura Thatcher Ulrich points that out. That when emotional moments come, she seems very excited to get into it. And when it comes, the first time it comes, it ends up being a story of a potential rape that has to do with the minister's wife. And so there's a lot there to unpack for students. And by the way, I've shown that movie for many years in a classroom of all boys, and they are riveted. They really are. They really do enjoy that movie. Now, there are a few that grumble, but basically they really they all take it very seriously, and I think they walk away from there. They write an essay about why did we watch this, making a strong case for it.
Oh, good.
Do any of the other participants want to chime in with questions, comments, or suggestions?
My two on the women in the war examples, sort of, in the business school model. I know we all know Deborah Sampson,
Yes.
and we all know the great job that our contemporary Deborah Sampson does making the presentation. My daughter had her for the 5th grade classes at a Brookline school, and it was a great success. But the other one that's not well known, and I think is fascinating in many of these things, is the wife of Colonel Michael Jackson. And the thing that's interesting about it is that her husband, all 5 of her sons, and everybody else, every male in her immediate family went from Lexington to 1783 away at the war, which makes me think that she was the real heroine in that family. And it was only years later that I discovered that she actually spent 2 years as a Continental Army nurse. And I can hear her saying to her husband, "Michael, if you think I'm sitting alone on this farm in Watertown while you're off at the war, you're crazy." So it's an interesting example of the fact that the women behind these patriots who fought the war were either running their own farms or living alone or taking care of their children, or in this case, getting themselves involved in the way that they can get involved. So she makes an interesting local story that covers several of these things.
That's really good. I think the local stories tell a national story. So you can take that local story. Students can find those local stories, or teachers can find those local stories. Park people can find them, bring them out, and then connect them to the wider theme. As you say, women did have that major role of running the households, and then actually finding, as you said, a way to be involved, and on all sides, on the loyalist side, on the patriot side, but also as people who were not involved, quote, in the fighting. There's a wonderful story here in Salem. I got to bring in a Salem story here. That there was a local doctor here in Salem, and he was against the war because he didn't like all the tar and feathering he saw, and he did see some in Newburyport and Salem. So when the war came, he embraced staying around to be a medic and be a doctor, and he was called a passive Tory, but he was very worried about his family, so he took his family. And his family left and went to Nantucket, where all the Quakers were, who didn't want to fight the war at all because they were opposed to war. And his letters to his wife are absolutely wonderful. So there's again a story of she's taking the kids and going out to Nantucket and living among the Quakers.
I think in August we'll be visiting a number of places. Paul Revere House. We'll also be looking at, we'll be going to the Royal House in Medford. So I think, we can also take a look further into the roles of women in the American Revolution. The other place that I encourage teachers to look into are their local historical societies. I don't know if you mentioned that. I just had a phone call, so I have to step out, sorry. But local historical societies definitely would have holdings of documents and records, and perhaps even diaries, families who lived in for generations may have donated or contributed some of the possessions and artifacts to those societies. So I definitely would recommend teachers to kind of contact their local historical societies and You know, I brought students to the Braintree Historical Society for a day to kind of let them
Hmm.
explore and take a look at the collections that that there were at the Historical Society. So I think that would be another great
Hmm.
way for students to learning and studying history and you know, start the process of doing some investigation
Yes.
and research. So
Well, I think that's, Gorman, really important to do and great to do, and make sure that we're connecting what's happening at the local level to some national, some important historical question that's driving what they're doing. One of the dangers of that is it becomes minutia, it becomes kind of arcania or antiquarianism. All could be interesting and for kids, but if it's not connected to sort of the wider historical issues, and when it's connected to the wider historical issues that we're thinking about in the present moment, the kids can then make connections to today,
Yeah.
and it becomes more alive for them, and they can write about it, or they can make a documentary film or a website, or however they display their understanding and engage with that material. It becomes great. I know that lots of students with National History Day projects at the middle school and high school level will choose local topics because there's a rich treasure trove of local sources. And the best of those projects are ones where kids then tie that in with current scholarship and push the envelope. And sometimes they're making discoveries that are well beyond what other historians are seeing, because they're uncovering local things that these local curators at a Marblehead Museum or a Manchester Museum or, you know, Cape Ann Historical Society has at their disposal, and somebody knows all about it who's been telling the story for a long time. Maybe telling the story, be careful of telling the stories that become sort of embellished. Again, we get back to Ray Raphael's idea of myths. You know, these things can be blown. The Sybil Luddington story had been a number of times a children's story, and it's filled with embellishment. So you have to be wary, I think, looking at these stories from a local angle, because of the potential of both embellishment and sort of aggrandizing. This is our local person. Wasn't she amazing, or wasn't he amazing because he went off and fought the war, and look what his wife did. Oh my goodness. All may be true, but it also can be blown out of proportion. I just caution you on that.
Well, it's true with anything. You know, Paul Revere's story certainly has never been embellished. So,
What was that, Bob? It's never not been embellished. Is that what you said? I would observe that at the moment, on your broad subject here, is that there is this growing mania to cleanse American history of the founding fathers, because they're all racist slave owners, and Betsy Ross's flag is equivalent to the Confederate battle flag, and the statues of Jefferson must immediately be torn down, etc. And there's no context about the fact that we wouldn't even be having this discussion if it weren't for the success of the American Revolution, because there wouldn't have been a government on earth that would have cared. And the other thing is that, for example, we have in our possession a bunch of clerks' rosters from the Siege of Boston, from Plymouth and Kingston, and over half the people on those rosters are Native Americans or African Americans. So there was a much larger involvement, particularly in this area, of African Americans in the Revolution than has made it into our history books.
yeah, well, actually, you triggered something in me in a positive way. I really recommend another book for your reading list, Marla Miller's book about Betsy Ross, because there is, of course, the myth, but then Marla does a great job showing who Betsy Ross was. She was an upholsterer. That is, she had a business in Philadelphia upholstering furniture. And so she's someone who worked with her hands and did this extraordinary craftsmanship in Philadelphia, which is why Washington and whoever was designing the flag knew about her. And of course, one story that comes out is that Washington had wanted 6-pointed stars, and Betsy Ross, who has real experience in cutting fabric, sees how difficult it would be to make a 6-pointed star, but a 5-pointed star is something relatively more easily done. But again, an extraordinary story about this person, and you think, boy, do I want to read a book about someone whose job is making upholstering furniture? It really shows something about the workings of the Philadelphia economy in this period, and about the workings of the economy in general. So Marla Miller, who teaches at UMass Amherst, and does other work on women craftspeople in the 18th century, well worth reading and well worth thinking about. This person, no, she wasn't doing it at the behest of the local Klan group making the flag, but was instead doing it in Congress.
Interestingly enough, it turns out that this was not her last contract on that, because the state of Pennsylvania contracted her to make all the colors for all their regiments.
Wow, okay.
So that flag actually expanded her business.
Oh, yeah.
And she stayed in the military colors for the state of Pennsylvania business thereafter. I don't know if that made it to the book or not.
Well, that's a good point, because then our students think, well, how do you make a flag? And that requires lots of different things. And it gets to the making of cloth, which is, again, something we were talking about earlier, what women were doing.
Well, and I think, Archer, your point is well taken in thinking about the complexity of the founding fathers. Yes, I mean, clearly they played a role. We're talking about women here in the American Revolution. So thinking about founding fathers and founding mothers, and how they, on both loyalist and on the revolutionary side, need to be understood. Not tearing down. It's not about tearing down monuments. It's about understanding.
Well, on the whole situation, we had a hubbub here in Brookline where they insisted on changing the name of the Edward Devotion School, which had been named the Edward Devotion School for 147 years, and then somebody discovered that he had actually owned a slave, so instantly he had to disappear from things. And much of my part of that argument was a poster I put on my weekly television show that said, "Teach history, don't erase history." And I think that applies here as well. The thing is, if these are the issues, then we need to teach people the context and the facts, and not whitewash over parts of history that at the current moment don't happen to be popular.
Right. I agree.
Well,
I wasn't going to say goodbye, but I am. I didn't want you to think I'm signing off in disagreement with Archer. But yeah, and launching a Twitter campaign. No. So this is a great discussion, and look forward to hearing more.
Thank you, Bob.
Take care.
Yeah, I think Archer, again, the point is to teach the conflict. So if it turns out somebody who's been heralded by a school named after him, a college, whatever, and turns out to have owned slaves, probably not surprising for a lot of people before the Civil War. What's the conflict? Let's talk about the conflict. Let's unpack that. I think that's, but with the American Revolution, people were talking about before the Civil War who were not involved in the Confederacy. It's a slightly different story than it is these Confederate statues that were put up in the 1920s or 1950s, commemorating, for example, Nathan Bedford Forrest, the governor of Tennessee, has just reenacted or just declared Nathan Bedford Forrest Day again. And again, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to digress away from women in the American Revolution. So we should probably come back to that.
Well, some of you may know that I spend a lot of time portraying Henry Knox. And one of the things that even elementary school children find very interesting is the story of Lucy Knox. At the Knox event last summer, they actually gave me time to speak about Lucy Knox. And one of the things that grabs them, and I don't know at what grade level you'd find this appropriate, but is that Lucy gave birth to 13 children. And in part due to the war and her insistence on traveling around after Henry, she only saw 3 of those children grow up. And it puts a different context on the life of women in the 18th century as opposed to in the 21st century.
Well, I think that that's a really interesting point. It sort of moves us to thinking about children. You know, so few kids would survive, and particularly in that Revolutionary War context. Another local story I'd add into that is the story of John Pickering from Salem, whose father was Timothy Pickering, and he ends up being as a young boy during the Revolution raised by his uncle, whose name also was John Pickering in Salem. But his father is sending letters home constantly with things to read. What should you read? He runs into Timothy Pickering runs into Noah Webster and gets Webster's speller and says you ought to start reading this speller. So the education of somebody like John Pickering, who ends up becoming a very prominent lexicographer, interested in language and interested in all kinds of things, as well as a lawyer. He's ends up being the first city solicitor of the city of Boston, is largely done during the Revolution without the benefit of his mother at his side, because his mother has gone off with Timothy, and then when Timothy Pickering moves to Pennsylvania, is there. And John Pickering is essentially raised by his uncle. But again, during this revolutionary context, with things being sent home by his father, who's encountering people like Noah Webster. It's an interesting story, and the role of women is interesting in its absence, I would say, in that story.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sure you all know that Timothy Pickering was the Quartermaster General of the Continental Army, and later Attorney General or Secretary of State of the United States. And an interesting local corollary is that his direct descendant is John Kerry, the former Senator and Secretary of State.
All right.
We've mentioned Abigail Adams several times, and I'm sure there are other people you want to talk about, but it's good to have you here. Good to see you.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me here. And I'm looking forward so much to having all of our teachers here soon to visit the Mass Historical Society. So yeah, I wanted to do just a brief introduction to the Mass Historical Society, to the kind of materials that we have, the work that you can do with us, and some of the things that you'll be getting to see when you come to visit us soon. So for those who are unfamiliar, have you talked much about it? Should I do the little intro to the Historical Society?
Go for it. Go for it.
Wonderful. All right. So the MHS, we are proud to be the oldest historical society in the country. We were founded in 1791, and so we actually, our first name was the Historical Society, as we were the only ones. And so if you look at the sort of the focus of our collections, in the early days, we really were collecting from all of the United States, which at that time was the 13 brand new states. And we're sort of founded, in fact, because one of our founding members, a reverend named Jeremy Belknap, was also doing some historical work and had been doing research on the Revolution. He wanted to learn more about the Revolution in New Hampshire, and was kind of realized at that point that a lot of the sources he wanted to work with were disappearing into private hands or even just getting thrown out. So he and a group of other like-minded founding members sent out a circular, which we still have today, requesting that we bring in and preserve some of these materials on the new country that we had to share and with the public generations going forwards. If you look at it, we have a lot of materials in those early days on the Revolution, but you can really find things here connected to any era in history. So, I don't know, if it's possible, could somebody click on collections here up at the top?
Norman, that would be you.
And Gorman, if you don't mind clicking on online resources.
Online resources.
Right down here. At
Oh,
the
right
bottom. Yep. So this is one place where you can look at a bunch of the materials we have digitized. We are primarily a manuscript collecting agency. We have about 13 million pages of paper. Only a fraction of that has actually been digitized, but a fraction is still pretty large. And it's a really good place to start off by getting a sense of the kinds of things that we have here. So for example, if you look just at our most popular online resources, you'll notice that we have the Adams Digital Collection. We are proud to have 2.5 presidential collections here. We have the bulk of the Adams family papers, and that goes over several generations. So we have both John and John Quincy Adams, and then my favorite is actually Abigail Adams. But beyond that, we also have their children and their grandchildren, and a large amount of that material has been digitized already. So you can look at it online, and you can actually download both the images and transcriptions if you're doing work with students. We also have half of a presidential collection in that we have Thomas Jefferson's personal papers. The Library of Congress snagged his presidential papers, but for some reason weren't as interested in the personal materials he had. So they ended up with his granddaughter, went into the Coolidge family, and then ended up with us. So that means that we have materials pertaining to his interest in architecture, some of his personal letters, books, and then also things that relate to the plantation. So including if you're interested in researching the history of Jefferson as a slave owner, you'll find a lot of those materials here. In addition, let's say, well, you can see here the 54th Regiment, the first African-American Union Regiment. We have a lot of their materials from the Civil War. Just as a sense of some of the other kinds of things we have. If you come up into the present day, we have Massachusetts materials in the ACLU. We have Massachusetts materials on the World War I, on civil societies around here, on suffrage, all sorts of things. But let's go back over and talk a bit more about what we have related to the Revolution, as that's this workshop. If you don't mind clicking right on the top here in that Subject Era Medium tab, you can see that you can search through our online materials by looking at some of the primary subjects we have, which includes the American Revolution or the era of the Revolution. But let's click on the American Revolution tab. So in Coming of the American Revolution, it's one of our most popular web features. And we're actually fundraising. We have some money to do a revamp with this. So we'll be working on creating new curricular materials and making the website a bit more accessible. As you can see, we were still using Flash when we developed this. It's a little bit out of date. But if you go in here, if you click on Browse by Topic, right at the bottom,
Oh.
There we go. I feel like I'm pointing at things and then realizing you can't see that.
That's all right. I do that all the time.
So it's sorted by some of the different sort of highlight events and moments during the Revolution. And one of the big ones, since we're talking about women today, would be non-consumption and non-importation. So women were critical in activism during the Revolution in how they influenced economic spheres. So you'll see actually here, one of the sources right above what's clicked on right now is an address to the ladies, which we'll probably be looking at when you visit. And that was a newspaper poem targeted at women who were doing the shopping for their families and trying to convince them to buy local. So women were crucial for boycotts, for activism around consumption. They influenced their partners in who was choosing what. So it was a really important role that they were playing during the Revolution. And you can find a lot of those materials in this portion of the website. Actually, and while we're here, if you don't mind clicking on right at the bottom of the screen where underneath the image, you can see how you can view image and transcription. If you could click on side by side, or so here, you can see you'll get a high visibility image, and you can actually, if you were to click on the print save button up at the top, which we don't have to do now, you would get a high resolution image that you can download, you can manipulate, and you can turn into a classroom resource. We also have the transcription for all of the materials on this website. This one is fairly clear to read, although it can be an adventure sometimes to parse out the different letterings, especially for that double S that you see with students. But you can also have the original image and then have it transcribed so it's a bit more readable for your students. And this is the case with all of our online digital materials. So if we could go back a couple of pages to that, the American Revolution sort of subheading. 2 more, I think. Thank you so much, Gorman, for doing this. 1 more.
Problem.
Oh.
Right here?
2 more back.
Oh, all right.
There we go. So we also have a bunch of other materials on the Boston Massacre, on art and artifacts, but I'd like to scroll down a little bit more. Do we have it in here? Oh, we don't. Okay, do me a favor. If you can scroll to the top.
All right.
And click on subject, era, medium again.
Yep.
And click on era of the revolution. There we go. So in here, since we're talking about women today, there are a couple of other folks I'd like to highlight. We have a collection, and we don't need to click on these right now since I'm sure we have other things we need to do. But we have a collection on correspondence between Mercy Otis Warren and Hannah Winthrop. So Mercy Otis Warren was an author, historian, and poet, and very active during the American Revolution. She was friends with the Adamses, and the correspondence between her and Hannah, who is another woman in this circle, is a really great lens for looking at the American Revolution. And I've actually often used with students a letter written by Hannah to Warren, and she's talking about her observations of the Battle of Lexington and Concord and what it was like to be with the people basically fleeing the area and watching from a nearby house the battle. It's really impactful. It's a very different perspective on the revolution, the opening to it, than students normally see in the classroom. It's a great kind of gateway into the topic. So both of them are these incredible resources. If we scroll down, you'll see African Americans and the End of Slavery in Massachusetts. That is something that is very clearly tied to the American Revolution. You can look at slightly post the Revolution at a woman like Elizabeth Freeman, who used the brand new Massachusetts Constitution after the war to argue that slavery was no longer essentially illegal underneath that new law. And her court case was one of the ones who brought about the end of slavery in Massachusetts. If we go down a little bit more, all right, I don't see her in here, but we have another web feature on Phyllis Wheatley, who was an enslaved woman who lived and worked in Boston, and she was the first published African-American poet in the country. So you can find materials that we have from her and letters between her and her friend Obor Tanner, who lived in Providence, was another enslaved woman, and their correspondence is another really great way of getting at the period of the Revolution through the eyes of African-American women living here. And you'll even find kind of small bits. So I won't even go in right now, but in the Siege of Boston, we have letters from women who were fleeing Boston and their experience of getting out of the siege. So if you'll find some, for example, Sarah Winslow Deming talks about fleeing to Dedham and the experience with her family of trying to get out before they closed the gates. If you go into the Revolutionary Art and Artifacts, you'll find a spoon that belonged to a woman named Relief Ellery, and she basically grabbed the spoon before running out of her house during the siege on Charlestown, and it's the only thing that survived. The house was bombed afterwards and burned. So all sorts of really great representations of women, and both the well-known names like Abigail Adams and the lesser well-known names. So it's a nice way to round out the experience of what it was like to live through the revolution and women's contributions to it.
Great.
So yeah, so you can see we have a lot of different resources here. Only, as I said, a fraction are online. And we'll talk more when you come to visit about ways to get at the stuff that's not online, as well as things like our teacher workshops where we engage with these materials with teachers. We have 3 upcoming summer workshops. We also do teacher fellowships if you wanted to come here and do research in those collections and create your own curriculum. And so again, we'll talk more about this when you come to visit.
I mean, this is absolutely amazing. I was not on screen, by the way. I was standing. I needed to stand for a little bit, listening to what you're saying. And just for teachers who are on now and who will come back and watch this later, about from the time we started here in this class until today, till this moment, really, what you're doing is showing that you can find great primary sources that are rich, Boston-oriented, Massachusetts-oriented, to grab kids and really pull them in. So please, the way you're talking about, Kate, about women in their involvement intellectually, their involvement on the war front, when they're fleeing, when they're engaging, and homespun, all of that. This is just a treasure trove, and it's all curated here. It's easily accessible. It's easily printable. So it all sounds like theory until you get Kate. And suddenly, wow, you can do this. This is teachable. This is real. This is not abstract. You don't have to go read Mary Beth Norton and her whole book on Liberty's Daughters, or read Linda Kerber. You can read them. You can excerpt them. But students can go to this site and find a source, and suddenly they're analyzing that source in a significant way, and also looking at something that's going to really blow their socks off. Because just looking at the sources is cool. So great.
You have to teach these topics anyways. They're part of the standards in the curriculum, but by bringing in even just one or two of these sources is a way to dive into the material. It brings it to life, I think, in a way that doesn't always come off the page in the traditional textbooks. So if you're talking about the Siege of Boston, Sarah Winslow Deming writes a letter to her friend. She's still kind of in shock. And she talks about herself and her daughters and her husband, waiting for her husband to get home, afraid he's going to be arrested, hearing that they're closing the gates on the one route to get out of Boston City proper, the Boston Neck. And so they go and they're frantically trying to find a carriage to get the family out in time. They finally manage to snag one and they get out. And then her husband says, no, I actually have to wait and I have to stay behind because I want to take care of our property. So they're leaving, they're hoping that he's going to come later, and then they hear the gates have been closed and he's still inside. And there are all of these rumors floating around. Have they been killing everyone? Is her husband alive? News doesn't travel fast necessarily. They also don't have a place to stay. They have all of their belongings with them. So they're essentially refugees from their own home. And she is writing about this to a family member of hers and just relating the experience. And it brings it to life in a way that's simply saying, you know, the British occupied Boston and doesn't necessarily do. And it also offers a lot of avenues then for kind of the further teaching, right? The content is all there in the letter. There's a lot that you can cover.
Well, and you're talking about being from a war, and our planet now is filled with people who are refugees from wars.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly you're seeing that could have happened. That happened in Boston in the 1770s and early 1780s. And it may be happening in Syria today or elsewhere today, and people fleeing as families. What does it mean to flee as a family? What kind of security do you have? And now suddenly you're talking about things that are in the news.
And I hear that you all read the Abigail Adams letter, the Remember the Ladies letter before this workshop. Is that correct?
It's one of the things that was on the list. Yes.
Should I take that as people intend to read it, or people have read it already?
No, we read.
Some people will be watching this after this moment, but I think everybody will have read it if they haven't read it already, and the concomitant letters of John together with it, you know, particularly his "You Are So Saucy" response.
So one of the things, and we won't be doing this one with you because we've spoiled it already. You've read the letter, but one of our favorite things to do with students is to actually take the letter, and we've divided it up into 4 sections. And we have each group, we say these are from letters that Abigail wrote in the spring of 1776. We have them look at the different sections and talk about what are some of the themes that are coming up, right? So I'll even toss it out to you. We of course have women's rights, right? But what are some of the other things that she talks about? Well,
for example, she talks about Virginia and what's going on with Dunmore.
Mm-hmm.
Economics, politics.
Yep.
Boston and evacuation and what's going on with her house and the state of the house that they left. And it was not so bad, not quite as bad as she thought.
So if you divvy this up with students and you give them each essentially a paragraph, and I won't torture this over Zoom, but the first section, you know, I mean, and she even starts out, I wish you would ever write me a letter half as long as I write to you, which is just wonderful, right? You know, you've got to give your husband a bit of a hard time. But she's talking about passion for liberty. She's talking about the philosophy of the revolution. She's talking about the role of women in society, the role of women in revolution and education. She's talking about sickness, saying, by the way, I'm here and everybody's getting smallpox. So you could write me a bit of a longer letter because we're worried about the kids. Worrying about the property downtown, talking about, like you said, kind of the siege and other movements. So there are all of these different topics that she covers in one letter, and we usually only read one sentence of it. We remember the ladies. But if you look at this letter and you parse it out and you really spend some time working on it with students, have them look at each little section, you see how savvy she is, how involved she is, and all of the different issues that are floating around at the same time, all of the considerations that make it into just one letter. So again, this is another one that if you're going to just read one source, it's a great source, and it's one that we usually don't use nearly as much of the meat of it as we could.
Thinking about connections, using that, and then thinking about letters that are written today, or going back and forth with people who are in conflict. Is a really interesting way of getting at the contemporary from this. What is she thinking about when people are writing to men or women, writing to their wives or girlfriends back home today, or women are writing to their boyfriends or husbands back home today with women in combat? What do those look like? So I think reading these letters provides an opportunity to think about the contemporary as well today, as well as the contemporary then.
And I think so much of what we want to try and do with our students is to build that context and to think about what it would have been like. There's so much mythology when you think about it that's really tied in with how we tell the story of the Revolutionary War. There's a lot of kind of heroic moments. I used to work at the Old North Church, shout out to them, and the story of Paul Revere, where you have to stop and parse with people. Well, he couldn't have hung the lanterns and then rowed himself across the, across the water and then looked back at his own lanterns to see if there was one or by land or two or by sea, the misconceptions. But I think that really happens with thinking about this war. And one of the things that these letters will do is bring that reality home. So the Hannah Winthrop letter I mentioned, she's writing to her friend about being in a house with about 70, mostly women and children. They can hear the battle outside. And then she talks about, as she leaves afterwards, seeing her neighbor go out with a wagon to find his son's body. And what I've done with students is actually had them practice transcribing very short excerpts of the letter, so they get to engage with what the writing looks like, see how far they could get, talk about it the way that we would here at the Historical Society. And then you stop and you say, okay, so what's in here that's different from the way that you usually learn about this event? It was like, do you see the blood? Do you talk about the impact on those families? Usually you're saying, they had the British running, and it gives it a different feeling. And I think it's a nice way to bring home what it was like to live during this.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, I have been waxing poetic, but I really enjoy bringing these sources out because I love seeing what the students are able to come up with when they look at them. Such a pleasure to meet all of you. I cannot wait to have you come visit us here. And I'm sure I'll be meeting you soon, but in the meantime, if you explore the website or if you're looking at our contents and you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me ahead of time. If there are things that that you'd like to see, we want to make this as special for you as possible.
Can I ask you a quick question before you leave?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you have Mercy's plays there?
You know what? That's a really good question. I'm sure that we have editions of them. I don't know how early the editions are. Let me find out, and I'll see if I can find some of them that we could pull out for the show and tell when you come to visit us.
They're a neat school resource.
That's a great idea. All right. Any other questions or thoughts before we head out?
Thank you. We'll talk soon.
All right. Thank you.
All right. All right.
Okay. Hi, from Edinburgh. Nice to meet you. Maybe you should just tell me your names briefly. I see you, Gorman. The others, I can't quite tell what your names are.
Got Charlie.
I'm Charlie. Well,
Hi, Charlie.
St. John's Prep in Danvers, Massachusetts.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Mark Huntington. I teach in Hingham, Massachusetts.
Okay. Great. Nice to meet you, Mark. Nice to meet you, Charlie.
And the rest of my name is Archer O'Reilly.
Archer O'Reilly. Nice to meet you, Archer. And anybody else?
We have Rebecca, but she's on mute, so.
Okay, well, I won't worry about that then. Okay, well, I'm super happy that I chimed in at the end of the last presentation, and I didn't catch her name either. What's her name? The one who was just presenting from Mass History?
Melchior.
Yeah. That was
Okay.
Kate Melchior.
Okay. Well, I actually prepared a little bit of material that follows right on from the letter that she was talking about in terms of a fuller response from John Adams, which is usually ignored. So but I was going to lead up to that. So if it's all right, I'll just start from the beginning of my presentation and we'll.
Great.
So I just did a quick slide here that touches on some of the key themes that I raised in my book about what the revolution really meant in terms of, well, for women and for children, underrepresented voices. And essentially, I'm arguing that the social order and the ideas about the proper ordering of society from the earlier period tended to emphasize that people were born to a place, and strangely enough, often influenced by the Bible. But strangely enough, that often could mean that some women and some children had a lot of power because you had power when you were born to it. So obviously some of the best examples of this are kings. So Edward VI became king at the age of 9. And you would say, oh, he had a guardian, but actually he executed his guardian when he was 12. So it doesn't, he had real power. But this went all the way down the social scale. So in my book, I talk about, I use as a comparison really 17th century England and the records I can find from the 17th century. And I point out that in many ways, children who were elite could hold power much earlier than we think. So there were many children between the ages of 12 and 21 who were elected to parliament in the 17th century, 40 alone between 1660 and 1700, for example. These were from wealthy families. You also had a seat in the House of Lords when you inherited the title. And this might sound like, well, it might generally be later, but it was an average age of 21 in the 16th century in England. So, and this wasn't just about high power, it was also about lower power. So one of the things that's really important and really interesting, I think, to talk about, even younger children can understand this, is that legally very young children often could bear legal responsibility that could get them into really huge problems. So in terms of indentures or labor contracts, for example, I found examples of children as young as 4 putting their mark on their own labor contracts. Think about it, binding themselves to labor until they turn 20, 21. This can lead to some pretty exploitative situations. I found children selling land. I found children marrying at very young ages. Under the age of 12 for girls and 14 for boys, you could technically annul it. There's a good example from Virginia in the late 17th century of that happening. But on the whole, this was, well, my larger point is that there was what we would now call ideas about meaningful consent were only gradually being argued about over the 17th and 18th century as part of the same arguments about the ideas of the consent of the governed that we associate with the revolution. And in a real level, the American Revolution meant a further articulation of the idea that not everyone was able to appropriately consent. In other words, to give this a more, a sort of a broader perspective, in a monarchical-based system, and well, I'm going to just say this generally, and then I'm going to talk about exceptions, but in a monarchical-based system where people are really born to a status, consent is much less important. And to some extent, many of those who, even in political theory, or argued that consent was important, people would say, well, what about children? And can't children consent when they're really tiny, like when they're baptized a member of the church and they become a subject, aren't they part of society then, and doesn't that constitute the nature of their consent? And that's what Thomas Hobbes argued, for example, and that's part of an older way of thinking about being born to a status that was part of the teaching of the Anglican Church in the 17th and 18th century. That act of being baptized when you're young makes you a subject, and therefore thereafter that's the only consent that you were able to offer, and that's binding on you, and it's binding on children, and it's offered when a child. But what John Locke and other early modern theorists argued about when they argued about consent and laid the basis for what we now think of as democracy was that if such consent offered by a child didn't have real meaning because they didn't understand what they were doing. And so you see a lot of arguments surrounding the American Revolution that that elaborated on those principles. And it was a different question, but sometimes often connected to children. What did this mean for women? So in other words, as you start to shift the basis of authority from birth status towards consent, you raise all these other questions. Now, in some colonies more than others, like Massachusetts, where they had much longer dissenting tradition, they had come to different answers than the Anglican Church on such questions as children's consent earlier. So some of these arguments were done in the debates over infant baptism in the 17th century. And so Massachusetts was often different, but to a great extent, even the way slavery was justified, you're born to a status, poor people are born to a status. This was shaping a lot of colonial ideas, but it was deeply connected to religion. This also meant that there was an attitude that people shouldn't learn, an attitude among royalists. It was better not to really encourage education or learning or teaching or the printing presses, because it would spread ideas. It would encourage people to think for themselves and to not agree that they were born to a status. So this is a famous quote from a letter from 20th of June, 1671, back to the authorities in England. He was answering questions. And he says, "I thank God we have no free schools nor any printing in Virginia, for learning has brought disobedience and heresy and religious sects into the world, and printing has divulged them, and libels against the best government. God keep us from both." We know that in colonies like Massachusetts and Connecticut from the very beginning, they did have some free schools where children would learn some very basic reading and writing, mostly focused on learning to read the Bible. But this limited education was part of this larger attitude of being born to a status where education wasn't that important, except arguably for limited religious purposes, because you weren't expected to have to do much more than be obedient, or that at least was the royalist ideal. And this is an image from Maryland in 1704, which obviously has a white boy and a black boy, but also a very wealthy white boy. His name was Henry Darnell III. We do not know the name of the black boy. But this encapsulates the ideals of being born to a status in certainly most of the southern colonies. And Massachusetts was, and again, many of the New England colonies and even Pennsylvania, where they had religious radicals like Quakers, were challenging some of these norms. But this was very much the ideal as embodied in the Anglican Church and in many of the southern colonies. And this is typical of the kind of restrictions on the press in almost all royal colonies. Royal governors had instructions not to allow any printing presses, as well as education, at least through the 1690s. Most colonies were not allowed printing presses, certainly all royal colonies, until the 1720s. So this went hand in hand with the restriction on education and the idea that people could be and were born to more of a status. And this is even most where they didn't have printing presses, like in Virginia, you were expected to publish in England, and you had to get the permission of royal censors who marked off that what you printed was legitimate. So as I mentioned before, Massachusetts had both free schools and printing presses, and I think it's just so important to keep the fact that of the difference in the back of your mind, and when you're teaching, to explore this with students about what it meant that they were allowed both printing presses and they had schools in Massachusetts sort of from the beginning. And this helped to create a different culture about what consent meant. And Massachusetts, earlier than anywhere I found in England, also introduced age regulations about who could vote. They introduced it first 18 in the 1630s, as well as church membership in order and being male in order to vote. Whereas you don't see those kinds of restrictions in England itself until much later. And I think this floats around larger debates about what it means to be able to give consent to church membership, and the way those debates about membership in a church and membership in the larger as a subject of the kingdom were connected in the early modern period. So what I really want to talk about then in a more practical level is voting and how voting worked. And I'm going to connect all of these ideas through letters of John Adams and others in just a minute. So this is actually a picture of voting in England in the 1750s. We don't have any good pictures of voting in America from now, but this fits with descriptions we have about how voting worked. And one of the things I want to get you guys thinking about as we through these issues of consent and what and underrepresented voices was voting was always oral. So regardless of which colony you look at before the Revolution, voting, this would have been, you would see somebody wanting to vote coming up and actually voting orally, where everyone could hear them, here or here, marking down who they would vote for. There's a quite famous story involving John Marshall at an election in 1799 in Frederick County. This is there in Virginia, the elections were usually on the front steps of a courthouse. But imagine for a minute a sheriff standing in the middle and two candidates, one of which is John Marshall and another of which is, I can't remember exactly his name, Mr. Oliver or something. And the candidates who are coming up to vote, walking up the steps towards the sheriff, and the sheriff greeting them by name and asking him how he wants to cast his ballot. And he would say, I want to cast my ballot for John Marshall. And Marshall would be standing here on the right or the left and would say, thank you very much, Mr. Chudsworth. I really appreciate your vote and I will always remember it. And why I'm putting this out there in the context of thinking through the revolution and what it means and underrepresented voices is that this oral voting really gave huge amount of weight to people who had property and privilege. Because if you were casting a vote and somebody had influence or power over you, if they were the property owner and you were their tenant, or you were a servant of theirs, or you were a woman married to a husband who had property and could influence how you voted, or you were a child and you had not yet inherited, you could be influenced very easily in this kind of oral culture and how you gave your consent. And this was a huge issue as colonists and others tried to debate, what does consent mean? Who can give it? This whole framework of how this consent was offered, in this case through voting, became crucial to how they actually debated it. So this is an example of a poll for burgesses from the year 1746. And what I want you to notice, and actually you could pull these similar items out for every single colony. What I want you to see is the poll for the elections for burgesses is that you have the names of those running, if you can see up here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you have the names. Everybody's allowed to vote for 2. And I can actually go down this list right now and tell you how Thomas Davis, the first person on the left, you see he has 2 votes here, that he voted for Fairfax, right? William Fairfax, and for Major Block Curtis, right? Can you see that? And likewise, you can go down Henry, Brewer, Tom, Joseph, I think it's Dickus, Richard Roberts. You can see how people voted, and this was part of this oral process of casting ballots in elections, where everyone can see you and where you can be easily influenced. And I also want to. I put these in kind of chronological order to just get people really thinking about how this kind of social order would work. But I also wanted to give you a sense of this question of dependency with regard to certainly large plantation houses, especially in the South. And this is a place called Drayton Hall, which still exists in South Carolina. It's one of the few mansions to survive the Civil War. And notice here, slave cabins, these no longer stand here on both sides of the main house. So a household included, in terms of dependents, not just women and children, but also slaves and servants. And this kind of image in reality, as well as this one sort of in the imaginary with the large house up here and the kind of dependencies, and these can include also tenant farmers, was part of the reality, certainly, of larger estates in the South. So as we think through questions about who can consent and how colonists were dealing with these questions by, to some extent, saying people who are dependent on others can be too easily influenced and therefore should not be able to give consent. You should keep in the back of your mind these kinds of images and the reality that was behind them from the colonial period. And again, this wasn't true of every colony. In many colonies where they had, in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, they had given out the land in much smaller states, and you had more family farms with fewer dependents. But these arguments of dependency continue to apply to women and children. And this is Robert Carter III and Frances Ann Tasker, who married he was a member of the Virginia Council, and she married him when she was 15 years old. She was from a prominent Maryland family. And they didn't inhabit exactly, they inhabited a different house called Nominee Hall, which no longer stands. But in terms of the elite, this also helps you understand a little bit about what such families were like. So not only did she marry at 15, but she had a lot of children. She had actually 17 children, and this is the list of them. Only 9 of which survived to adulthood. And I want to pause here for just a minute and say a little bit about the social realities for other families as well in the pre-revolutionary period and the period going up to the American Revolution. If you put together all the data we have from different kinds of sources that scholars have been able to analyze about average family size, about when women married, about there's actually some really good analyses about using Revolutionary War pension records from family size just before and even during the Revolution. What we come up with is that outside of the elite, other women had on average something like 9 children. They married on average at about 20. Their last birth was at age 42 and a half. And they were nursing most of the time in between, and that served as a kind of natural birth control. So one of the other issues that I want you to be thinking about as we consider these issues of women and children and dependency is that women in particular were much busier with child rearing than modern women would be. I mean, to the extent that, I mean, not that you can say this in an elementary school classroom, but that most women wouldn't have periods, for example, from the age of something like 20 to 45, and because they would be so often. But this gives you also a sense of how dependency worked in terms of slaves, which I know you know about. So what I now want to turn to is what did the revolutionary arguments mean for these older ideas about dependency? And I'm just going to scroll through. Sorry, this slide didn't work exactly right, but this is the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and sorry, it doesn't work without the larger, but before even the American Revolution, it was before the Declaration was written, it was laying down ideas about all people are created equal, they should be able to consent to their own government, and of course the American Revolution went even further with this, and these ideas were everywhere. They were part of what was justifying the revolution, and that's why in the earlier discussion you had this, I know you guys read this letter from Abigail to John in March 31st of 1776, where she's taking these ideas and she's deliberately extending them to women. And she has this famous passage, which I know you guys have read, that your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. And such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and enduring one of friends. But essentially, she said, she's arguing that we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So these ideas about everybody should be able to consent are having this really powerful effect in shifting debates about the nature of power. It's hard to tell exactly what percentage of men voted in, and it was in the 18th century mostly men who voted, or all, I mean, as far as we know, all men, although it's a little bit complicated, but who voted before the revolution, but maybe depending on the colony between 30 and maybe at its height in Massachusetts, something like 60%. But there were a lot of men who could not vote, just like a lot of women and children and servants and obviously slaves. And so the revolutionary ideas were really opening up different bases for power. And John, this is the original of the letter, and this is John and Abigail Adams. John Adams, when he responded to Abigail, and I don't know if you read this letter, kind of laughed at her. So he says, be patient. As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were growing turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But he's essentially kind of ignores her. However, very interestingly, and I can send you a link to this if you like, the real response that John Adams gave to James Sullivan was on May 26th, was to James Sullivan, not to Abigail, on May 26th of 1776. And here I'm going to try to draw together some of the various issues I've raised about consent and who should be able to consent and voting in particular, by talking through the realities of how consent worked in terms of what the ideas that John Adams is expressing in this letter. So he says, it is certain in theory that the only moral foundation of government is the consent of the people. But to what an extent shall we carry this principle? Shall we say that every individual, I mean, you can read it, of the community, old and young, male and female, as well as rich and poor, must consent expressly to every act of legislation? No, you will say, this is impossible. How then does the right arise in the majority to govern the minority against their will? Whence the right of men to govern women without their consent? Whence the right of the old to bind the young without theirs? And so he then goes down to say, let us first suppose that the whole community of every age, rank, sex, and condition has a right to essentially to vote when assembled. But he goes on to say, but why exclude women? You will say, because perhaps they don't have enough practice and experience, they're busy, they're too busy with children, which we've just talked about. And he says, children is easier. They have not judgment or will of their own, but will these reasons apply to others? And his next argument is about men who don't have property. He says, is it not equally true that men in general in every society wholly destitute of property are also too little acquainted with public affairs to form a right judgment and dependent upon other men to have a will of their own? So when I'm reading this, I want you to again imagine the scene that I painted for you about what actual voting looked like in the colonial period. It was always oral. So imagine how powerful people could influence those who are less powerful. And this is absolutely in the back of Adam's mind. And he says, very few men who have no property have any judgment of their own. They will vote as they are directed by some amount of property who has attached their minds to his interests. And then he says, he continues, this is just, there's not even a ... This is just the next part of the letter. He says, he's responding here now particularly to James Sullivan. He says, how can people be bound by laws and punished by them if they don't consent, which is an even larger question than taxation. And they go, what reason should there be for excluding a man of 20 years, 11 months and 27 days? Like when you admit one who's 21, the reason is you must fix upon, and he says it's arbitrary how you're gonna judge this, but you're just gonna set some standard. And finally, he says the same reasoning, and here's the real clincher for his whole argument, the same reasoning which will induce you to admit all men who have no property to vote will essentially allow you to include women and children. But he says these ideas are really dangerous. We don't want to let any of these people actually vote. Depend upon it, sir, it is dangerous to open this source of controversy and altercation, as would be opened by attempting to alter the qualifications of voters. New claims will arrive. Women will demand a vote. Lads from 12 to 21 will think their rights not enough. And every man who has not a farthing will demand an equal voice with other in all acts of state, intents and destroy all distinction and prostrate all ranks to one common level, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I think is really cool about this, and I think even with younger children, you can raise some of these issues and think about the questions of what oral voting means and how that can shape the debate. But I think it's also really important to keep in the back of your mind that there are actually solutions to some of these questions that you can answer by rethinking the process of voting. And that's exactly what Americans did after the revolution. So I know that all of you are aware that we do not have oral voting anymore. We have actually really complex kinds of secret ballots. But secret ballots are the obvious solution to these questions of influence and dependency. And in fact, secret ballots went hand in hand with extending the suffrage in the years after the revolution. In some states, it happened relatively quickly. In some states, it took longer. I've actually held in my hands the ones for North Carolina. So in 1796 in North Carolina, you can pull out the records in the archives and you see, just as I showed you for Virginia, the name of all the candidates and all of those who voted right underneath. You can see how they voted even today. In 1797, if you pull out the records, you see the list of the candidates with how many votes they got. You have the list of the voters, and then you have little envelopes full of little torn slips of paper with the names of who they were voting for, written often without being, in incorrect spelling, etc. But this is the first introduction of the secret ballot. And what the secret ballot is it cuts right through these arguments about dependency. So there's only one state that we know about where women were able to vote immediately in 1776, and that was only women who had property, because the law said explicitly included women. And also, but it also said people still had to have property. So it fits with the ideas about dependency that John Adams expressed. That right was taken away from women, from property women in New Jersey in 1807 after they swung an election against somebody who then later on got elected elsewhere and sought to make sure, or he thought they had swung an election against him. But in terms of children, the revolution actually marked a solidifying of the idea of a kind of voting age and an age that qualified you for higher ages, that qualified you for holding all kinds of legal status, from really high positions of political power to really low questions of who can consent, because it helped to articulate ideas about people shouldn't consent. It helped to solidify notions that people should be able to consent when they can be manipulated, when they're vulnerable. They need to be taken care of. So the revolution also marked an expansion of the ideas of parental custody, of guardianship, of others making decisions for children in their best interests instead of the children themselves. And it also led to an expansion of ideas about what must be done to prepare children for playing the roles they need to play. That said, I just put this in there to emphasize issues I know you guys know already about that the revolution impacted everybody of every sex and condition, of every status. This is a picture of the British landing, an engraving of the British landing in New York City in September of 1776. And of course, everybody in all these buildings, all the families would be affected in some ways. And there were examples of some young men who did sign up to fight. One of my favorite is Joseph Plum Martin, and this is his narrative. This is an edition published in 1830. It's a great thing to use while teaching. I would encourage you to find and include some of this account, especially from the beginning. He has a description at the beginning, and this relates to what I'm talking about consent, where he signed up to fight when he was only 15. And what the actual process of what happened was he was wondering whether he should do it, and he had the pen in his hand, poised above the paper, but he hadn't put it on there. He hadn't put his mark on there. He didn't know how to write. And somebody nudged him, and the pen went down and touched the paper, and they said, and everybody then said, you put your mark on the paper, you're now bound, and you have to be a soldier. And that's a really good example of how in the earlier period, this, notions that we take for granted that, of course, under 18, you can't be bound by a debt, or you can't have a credit card, is what we now say, or any legal act you do would not be binding. This was not true in the earlier period. And Joseph Plum Martin was considered bound by putting his mark down to enlist as a soldier when he was 15 in 1775. So, so what I want to talk about for the rest of the time of my little short presentation, and then I'll take whatever questions you want, is something that I think is really important, that's a positive thing that comes out of all this in terms of the revolution, and that is it really lays the foundation for public education, and for the idea that education is really crucial to create the potential for this society where all people can be free and equal, where government can be based on the consent of the governed. So what you see is a lot of arguments, and there's a very famous set of letters between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams on this question, for example, in 1813. A lot of arguments about not only the question of dependency, but also the issue of what kinds of information do people have to have in order to be able to vote, and an emphasis on the idea that everybody should be educated, certainly all men, and to a lesser extent all women, in the sense that they're also going to be helping to educate their own children as potential citizens and voters. The sense that only education can enable an informed voter. So once you have the secret ballot and that obvious question of dependency is gotten rid of, you have to be educated enough that you can discern truth from falsehood, right from wrong, that you can know about what people have done in the past, that you can read about history, for example. Especially history was something that was taught as schools expanded after the revolution. And what you see in virtually every state, and these changes all happened on the state level, but we see in virtually every state is some discussion about whether there should be public education and to whom it should be given, how long it should extend. Now, many states, especially in the South, didn't decide to fully fund public education. There's a one of my favorite examples of this is what happens in Virginia, where in 1796, both houses of the legislature, the lower house votes to support and fully fund essentially what we call elementary education for almost everyone who's free, boys and girls. But the upper house, which is more elite and has a property qualification for a higher property qualification for voting, in Virginia, strips the bill of all the money to support it. Now, many localities are still able to support that. In fact, one of the things they're doing is selling off the former Anglican churches and using that money to fund public schools, but it's still very narrow and limited. Elsewhere in other states, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, within 20-25 years of the revolution, you have the basics of public education, certainly elementary school, free public education for all those who are free, and obviously this excludes slaves for the most part. And more importantly, you also, or not more importantly, but the other side of this is you also have more funding for higher education. So you have an expansion of public support for universities in many states as well. And it relates to these ideas of educating a citizenry. This is just a quick picture of the Northwest Ordinance, so of 1787, which set aside one parcel out of the 36 parcels, which each, as Americans expanded westward, one parcel was to be set aside to support public education. This was, of course, drafted by Jefferson. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is, in some ways, the revolution for real children meant a larger debate that actually stripped them of some, if you can call them rights, except that the idea was that they could be exploited if they didn't really know what they were doing. Like in the example of Joseph Plum Martin, maybe at 15 he wasn't really quite ready to make such a big decision and shouldn't be bound by it. Certainly when you look at an example of a 5-year-old writing an apprenticeship contract, that you can see how that can be exploited. But the compensation for this was this emphasis on public education, which was supposedly supposed to create not only informed voters, but also, and this is one of the fascinating things about this discussion, public education was supposed to create some of the possibilities for equality. If you don't have massive property confiscation and everybody starting with exactly the same thing, and there were pamphlets that talked about these issues, then, and I can actually find some for you if you want to use them as examples, that if you're not going to have massive property confiscation, how do you create some equality of opportunity? And that was the other reason behind the push for public education. For the most part, though, in a strange way, the American Revolution, while it opened up these possibilities, also led to a certain amount of backlash. Just as you see in John Adams' letter, where he says, we don't want to open these questions. It's too frightening what could happen as a result. Who knows which boundaries are going to be redrawn? Who knows who will be asking for privilege and power? All of the bonds of society might be destroyed. What you see is actually a reinforcement of some of the traditional social order, and this happens particularly with respect to women. So there's a book by Rosemary Zagari, which is one of the best. She just literally calls it Revolutionary Backlash, and she tracks how some of the challenges that are raised by women themselves, not only Abigail Adams, but way beyond her voice, as in New Jersey, get shut down because of fear by the mostly white men who control the voting process about what might happen if you extend these rights too far. So what I think is interesting to emphasize is the extent to which you have a kind of contest over these issues. One of the ways that traditional status is reinforced is by returning to the common law, and particularly to, I would say, a kind of Enlightenment version of the common law that's kind of at the same time reactionary, which is that put out by William Blackstone, who writes a set of commentaries on the common law in England in the 1760s, which are reprinted in America in 1772. And by the 1780s, 90s, Blackstone's name and common law, he's seen as the father of the common law, or not, just the easiest way to learn the common law, to encapsulate the common law. But he has in his treatises a parallel between the status of husband, wife, parent, child, master, servant, which in some ways actually makes women's status even more subservient to the husband, and clearly puts all of the property in the family much more distinctly in his hands. And he focuses on the idea of coverture of women once they're married having the legal identity of the husband. So as you can see in law schools in the late 18th, early 19th century, these ideas being taught. And so, but I would put these into the category of reaction against the principles of the revolution, by returning to older norms to some extent. The last few images I have are just from early school books, and aren't that crucial. So I could talk much more about practical examples, but why don't we just stop and have you guys ask me questions?
I'd like to ask, I think you said that secret ballot originated in North Carolina in 1797, is that it? Is that the first instance?
No, that's just one example. Actually, no, the first instance would be Philadelphia in 1776. And there are examples of secret ballots being used in like small meetings earlier, but not, as far as I know, for larger voting. But no, right. Pennsylvania, in their first constitution, introduces them in 1776, along with universal manhood suffrage and the voting age of 18.
So that was the original.
I just have held in my hands. Yeah, that's the original one. I just was giving the North Carolina example because it happened state by state in different times, but I've held the North Carolina ones in my hand. So it was so amazing to see the different records.
Just for interest's sake, you talk about this young soldier, Charles Jackson, who was the youngest son of Colonel Michael Jackson, enlisted in the Continental Army at the age of 10 and was commissioned an officer at the age of 16 and served till 1784.
Yeah, it's actually widespread. I mean, for me, the real issue is we shouldn't normalize the legal status of childhood as we do now. It was much more fluid, and especially in terms of things like that. I mean, there's so many examples of young children, of young men in particular, signing up. I hadn't known his example in particular, so thanks for sharing it. But yeah.
I was reading your article, The Children's Right in the American Revolution, and I was just, this is more like, this was more like a comment. It was like, it just kind of, because I never really thought of it before, about how the revolution impacted children's rights, and for lack of a better term, taken away or have been regressed. And so I just never had thought about that before, about how children had much more rights prior to
like legal identity, but you're right. It's, you always have to think about it in quotes. And for me, it's when I look at, I mean, for example, the age limit of statutory rape was 10, for example. So if you were 9 or under, it could be statutory rape. And that was only from a law of Queen Elizabeth's. And so a lot of the protections that we sort of take for granted for children weren't there at the same time. And you can see how it could lead to more exploitation. And the other thing is that it often changed in fits and starts. And so the age of marriage, with the common law age of marriage of 12 for girls, and again, earlier they had been able to marry, but they had to get a divorce. They could get a divorce at 12 if they sought it. But the age, it turned into just a minimum age for 12 in most states. And that didn't change in many cases. And so there's still a few states even today where it still has a common law age of marriage of 12. And yet other rules, like you have to be 14 in order to testify in a court of law, which became the norm by the early 19th century, could lead to, you can imagine the kinds of abuses it could lead to.
Holly, I had a question.
Sure.
Do you think the fact that maybe they didn't have, states didn't have, or colony states, whatever, didn't have like social programs to take care of orphans, that they were more willing to give kids rights because they didn't want to deal with, having, a state or adoption agencies or anything that didn't exist back then?
Right. So they did actually have systems for dealing with children who were orphans in every state. And I've looked at a lot of those records. So in Boston, they had what were called the Overseers of the Poor. And that was the normal title. I mean, in Virginia before the Revolution, the church wardens of the Anglican parish would deal with these questions. But their normal response was to bind out the children. So this was, white children. I found for Virginia in the 1750s, the county that I was looking at was Frederick in detail. About 7.5% of the white children in the county were bound out as laborers by the church wardens in the 18th century, in the 1750s, at an average age of 7, until they turned 21. And that was the system of dealing with poor children and orphan children. Now, if you were orphaned and you were wealthy, you had a guardian and you were given, education that would fit your status. And you had a lot more rights, even as even though you had a guardian, it was sort of limited rights of the guardian, and they mostly ended when the child was 14, if you were going to inherit
property that you inherited, basically.
But guardians were only appointed to heirs, so it wasn't a universal category. So in terms of your larger question, they didn't have this social network, and therefore, I would say it's actually more connected to this idea that you're kind of born to a place. So, in fact, I found really startling examples in those records. If a family was poor, the laws allowed rich families to essentially point to the poor family and say, I want that boy to be bound to me as a servant until he turns 21. And the church warden would often do it. So some of these cases, actually, both parents are living.
Wow.
I just wanted to...
It's partly just that the whole notion of consent is not as well articulated, and they cared more about the format of things. Did you put your mark somewhere?
Yeah.
They didn't. The whole notion of meaningful consent just wasn't there in the same way.
I just want to chime in. That question about bound out and about overseers of the poor. That there is a website, primaryresearch.org, that has the Boston Overseers of the Poor records that were all gathered by the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, and then
That's great.
Project Colonial Society did. They are online, and I put that in the chat feature over on the right. And also go there. There's also a number of bound out records, and a lot about apprenticeship and bound out. So that's a really rich treasure trove for looking at.
It's a really rich treasure trove, and there's a collection of essays in a book called Children Bound to Labor, which compares the different colonies, which is actually really helpful. So in fact, in some of the northern colonies, they also had systems of what were called out relief for families, where whole families could be kept together and given some sort of minimal welfare payment and taken care of within other households. in a lot of the southern colonies like Virginia and South Carolina, what you would see instead is the whole, if a child could work, they would be bound out, and if a parent could work, they too would be forced to labor. It was only people who literally could not work who were given any kind of welfare payment.
It might be interesting to note that Deborah Sampson, who has a lot of other things, women in the military, one thing, also was bound out at about 7 or 8 years old, and actually joined the Continental Army to escape the abusive treatment she got in being bound out.
Right.
I'd also observed that at least in New England in the 17th and 18th century, the best social position for a woman who could manage it was to be a widow. In most instances, you find that women whose husbands died married again as quickly as they possibly could. But if they were left with a significant amount of property, they tended to never remarry because they had full control of that property and their place in the community as if they were their deceased husband.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting dichotomy. So the best thing to be is a affluent widow. And it's interesting, they didn't remarry. Non-affluent widows remarried as rapidly as they could.
Yeah.
And that goes again to New Jersey, where they actually could vote.
Right.
For those few years, 1778, I think, until 1804.
Yeah.
Well, they could vote. They could, just for interest's sake, they could vote in the Plymouth colony as long as it lasted.
Right. Yeah, I think there's more. It's more complex than we sometimes assume. Virginia passed a law in 1699 preventing women from voting, and Africans and children under 21. But before that, it looks like that was happening to some extent. We just don't have complete voting lists. It's not. We don't know. So
it's
would be popular.
Nothing is as simple as it seems.
Right.
Is both the challenge and the opportunity of education.
Right. I know. Isn't it great?
Because it's easier to teach simplistic principles, and unfortunately, there's plenty of examples of doing that.
I know.
But it's much more interesting when you don't.
Right. I agree. So 100%.
Right, Archer.
Exactly where I am.
It's what makes teaching rich and wonderful for the students when they discover things and then make it more complex than they thought when they started.
It feels like there's no one right answer, and they can just throw out examples and that whole process.
Right.
Yeah. So one of the things I was going to mention that didn't was that the origins of children's literature, as we know it, were in the 18th century. And this started with Newbery, who's responding, John Newbery in England in the 1740s, who is responding to John Locke's call for a literature dedicated to children to encourage education. And of course, with Isaiah Thomas, picks up that call in Massachusetts and after the Revolution and publishes a whole bunch of books. Books like the Tom Thumb's Little Pretty Pocketbook and many others. And actually the American Antiquarian Society website has a lot of those books. So if you're interested in pursuing that kind of angle in the classroom, that's a cool thing to do.
I'm intrigued by the whole notion of consent and the revolution being about consent in the broadest possible way. And I'm thinking, and I'll keep thinking about this, and I wonder if others are thinking about this, how would you frame that as a question for a high school class of students to think about consent? What series of 6 or 8 documents could you point students to do a sort of a classroom model for it and then send them out to find their own things? I wonder if you have any thought about that.
Right. That's so my book about these questions is called By Birth or Consent, and it has citations to a lot of things. One of my favorite ways to approach that is to use some of the Tory pamphlets that
Okay.
mocked, that appeared, that were published all over the colonies in the lead up to the revolution, that mocked the claims to consent that the patriots were making. And they're like, what do you mean there's no, no taxation without representation? What do you, like, all kinds of people pay taxes who you don't really think should be able to consent. What do you want? And they go down this list, and you can find the citations there, and you can find the original poems pretty easily. But like, every man, woman, child, infant, baby, horse, cow, and pig, chicken, like they put all these lists, so like they completely, and there's more sophisticated responses to these questions by James Otis, for example, who ends up in a mortuary. I mean, but who essentially, it's on the question of consent that he starts to back down. And this is, of course, central to the whole notion of virtual consent in the lead up to the revolution. And when the British authorities are saying, what do you mean everybody doesn't consent? And you don't really mean that. And members of parliament are virtually consenting for you and considering your interests when we. So those are some sources that I would recommend. But I think, an excerpt from Joseph Plum Martin's account, it's all over John Locke, for example, but I would actually just start with the Declaration of Independence, just the introduction, and talk about the principles that are laid out there, and then ask who is it meant to include. And by the way, a really important thing for me is if you look at the deleted clauses of the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson talks about Africans being enslaved, he actually he uses the word men to refer to them in big capital letters and in italics. So he clearly meant to include them. But what about women? What about children? In terms of Jefferson, one of my favorite letters from him, and I could find this for you guys if you want me to afterwards, was a letter from Jefferson to Abigail Adams, written after he arrived. He'd been staying with the Adamses in London. He was on his way to be the French ambassador. This is about 1786. And he writes this letter to Abigail Adams, and he sends her a copy of a Virginia law that he's just written. And he ends the letter with this sentence. He says, "Notice I used the word persons, period." And I read that. I was reading through Jefferson's correspondence. I read that and I realized that she must have been getting on his case about the word man in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. So he sends her a copy of this other law and he says, look, I used the word persons, like I'm enlightened. And you think like this is just a 20th century or a 21st century issue. No, this was clearly, these questions were melting all kinds of characters.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
On the subject of consent, one of the important aspects of context of that discussion relative to the revolution is that Bob Allison and I find all the time, almost every student is amazed to be informed that during the revolution, 1/3 of the population supported revolution, 1/3 were loyalists, and 1/3 just wanted to be left alone. And it's that last third that opens all kinds of interesting discussions. At the moment, our politics are being governed by the 1/3 who just want to be left alone.
That might be true. One of the other things that, I don't know. I was going to mention this interview that Alexis de Tocqueville did with Charles Carroll, the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence in 1829. And he traveled down to Maryland explicitly to interview him because he was the last one alive. And Charles Carroll had about 300 slaves and lived on this vast estate. And Tocqueville has these extensive notes on this interview, and he says, and here's this guy talking like an English lord. And when he asked him about all these changes that have come in the wake of the revolution, like the abolition of entail and primogeniture and other things. And he says to Charles Carroll, then in his 80s, he says, I don't understand. You regret all these changes that have happened with the revolution, all these legal reforms. You talk like, you live on this vast estate. He says, why did you sign the Declaration of Independence with these principles in it? And Charles Carroll says to him, Well, we thought England would back down. I didn't really agree with all those things that were in the Declaration. And I tend to think that he actually was more radical when he was younger, because you can see his names on committees to reform Maryland's laws, and he was pushing a lot of reform, which was happening, by the way, a lot on the state level. This is really important to me to acknowledge. But there's he would fit into that category of someone who began to doubt that you really should be pushing these principles if he even agreed with them completely in the first place. Yeah.
Well, I've known 1,000 legislators in my life, and I would be willing to bet heavily that not one of them has ever voted for a bill they didn't write in which there was not something that they didn't particularly agree with. That's part of the legislative process.
Right, that might be true.
Nobody gets everything,
Yeah. But there's a lot of examples of real children, and it includes questions of criminality, and I think that's one of the more interesting questions. You saw this even a little bit in John Adams' response to James Sullivan. He says, can people be found guilty of a crime if they can't consent? And there's a lot of, I found a lot of examples of children being found guilty of crimes and pretty heavily punished, particularly before the revolution. But the question becomes, is intent similar to consent? Is it the same thing? Can you, if you can't fully understand the issues enough to vote, are you fully responsible for your actions if you commit something bad? And in the long run, this leads to separate juvenile courts, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of interesting issues. One of my favorite chapters of my book is actually about children's criminal responsibility and how that changes over time. Because there's no notion of even negligence in the law in the 17th century. I found examples of a 6-month-old being put by the, next to the fire by a mother and falling into the fire, and she's found guilty of her own death in the records, for example.
Who was that?
We think about negligence as being something obvious. Of course, we've always had that understanding, but it's not true.
Well, I think that this is could really grab high school and middle school kids, or college kids, or an audience, but particularly kids. Students, at least at my high school, are really interested in what pushing the boundaries with their parents, of course,
right,
and pushing the boundaries with the school, and then seeing, the school demands I do this, but I don't want to do this. So,
right.
because I signed up to come to the school,
they love. Yeah, you're exactly right. They love this stuff. They absolutely love it because it denaturalizes ideas that have been told to them over and over again about, that of course, it makes them realize that people were debating these questions really fiercely in the 18th century surrounding the revolution, in the year surrounding the revolution. It is
absolutely.
You can find a lot that you can, and some of the actual legal cases that I dug up are kind of disturbing and involve sexual issues you might not want to bring up with the proceedings. But if you feel like you have a mature crowd, you can, and of course they're completely relevant. So I have a case of a 12-year-old who was raped by her tutor right after she turned 12, and she was an heiress due to inherit a lot of money, and the courts ruled that she was too young to testify in a court of law because the age was now 14. This was right after the revolution in Virginia, but she was old enough to get married because they still had the old marriage laws, and that was the best solution in this case. So the tutor couldn't be charged with rape, and the father was so irate he wrote a 4-page letter to the Virginia legislature and got a law changed. But again, this might be, I think if you're teaching at a high school, this might be something you could consider using. But there's a lot of other cases that I talk about in my book that are much more, that don't involve such delicate issues. So
I think building a curriculum which had 6 to 8 documents, from various points of view, like you said, the Joseph Torrey, John Locke, Declaration of Independence, and then 2 or 3 or 4 really interesting cases would be a great entree for high school kids to get into the issue of consent and
Right.
seeing the role, seeing children, women in this change, this dramatic change during the American Revolution.